going to talk about network security and, more importantly, some of the newer threat vectors that we're seeing, every day, almost multiple times a day. We're seeing new, well-known, brand name organizations have breaches. Of course, most recently, the University of Maryland announced today their breach, College Park. We are faced with an onslaught of attacks coming in such a rapid pace, and they're morphing and changing in so many different ways that we're innovating different approaches to combat this problem and try to solve it. Most people are aware that networks have a firewall, right? Can anyone tell me what the firewall is supposed to do? Barrier against vulnerable. Yeah. Okay.
Deny by default. To the router, which is allowed by default.
That is a
Sounds like a lot of you are thinking about fast forward to today's threats. Go back to the historical reasons behind what a firewall was. It was used in a university, and it's an open policy. What was its basic premise? Can anyone think? It's a very simple answer. It's not a trick question.
Well, in a more generic sense, I used to live in a townhouse, and every townhouse has to have a firewall between them, so if this one burns down, it doesn't ignite the one next to it. So that's kind of a baseline.
Well, the way they were designed in the network originally was to allow an authorized application into a user that was authorized to use that application. Very tight security. So an explicit deny all, and you would only allow exactly what you want to. And an example of that would be an application like Telnet. You open up on a firewall, port 21, you allow Telnet into Hassanain's computer that has an IP address. Very tight security, but that was 20 years ago. So what's changed today? What's changed with the approach there? What do you think that the firewall now, what purpose does it serve when you open up many ports on a firewall? And applications, as you know, have morphed and changed, and there's a variety of applications, thousands, hundreds of thousands of applications, and they could care less what port they're on, right? And they're encrypted most of the time. And would you believe that a lot of threats do hijack those applications, they come in on those applications, right? So big problem with the firewall, A. And then you have a lot of products sitting behind the firewall in a typical network that are shoring up security that firewall's not handling. So what we're going to talk about today is about the threat vectors and how they've changed. And what we're doing, what we're trying to see as innovation around beating these threats or helping with this cat and mouse game.
So here's an interesting quiz, right? So if you think about a lot of the standards out there, whether it's PCI or something else, what is the key ingredient to preventing data breach? What does PCI require? And I'll give you a hint, something to do with segmentation. So you have lots and lots of LAN segmentation. So you prevent no one from this LAN accessing another LAN, different VLAN access, keep them separate. Why not extend that? Why not extend it to an application? We've always talked about, this address space shouldn't talk to this address space with the quite knowledge that, that address space may contain cardholder information. But has anyone taken the next step level and said, within that segmentation, the only traffic allowed on it are these known applications? Now let's go back to what Clint was saying, which is how then do you define applications? Today, and most firewalls out there, the way they do things is by saying, I'm going to open up port 53 because I know I have to let DNS out. Can you guarantee it's DNS? So if you look at the next set of generation of firewalls that are coming out, the key ingredient there is they're beginning to take a look one step further and saying, let's enforce what we're talking about. If we're going to allow SharePoint, and we know there are a bunch of ports on SharePoint, making sure it's SharePoint and let the firewall figure out what those ports are and make sure on that port it's the authorized application. So if you allow FTP, then it's FTP on that port and not something masquerading on that port. So that's one example of where you can look at and kind of narrow down the threat vector there. If you can kind of look at the segment and look at the application and enforce it. So that's next generation firewall. But then you may say, what about the applications itself? What if they get hijacked? So malware writers are pretty good, right? So hence, if you look at what Clint was saying in terms of what is behind the network, you've got the firewall, and then you've got the other products, the IPS, IDS systems, you've got the URL inspection engines. What again are they there to do? You talked about it when you fast forwarded the answer by saying to prevent threats. So what does an IPS, IDS system do? It looks at signatures. Where do you think they get the signatures? So if I go back 5 years, the typical scenario is honeypot sites, lots and lots of it. You put 100, 200, couple hundred honeypot sites out there, and you let any activity that goes to those honeypot sites be known as threats that you don't want, build a signature against it, and you say that's unwanted traffic. Well, hackers have got a little savvier than that because they're beginning to look at targeted environments. They go after specific companies, specific organizations, specific persons within the organizations, and they craft it with a payload that comes from what they consider authorized. So you will click on that spreadsheet because you know it came from an authorized source because it was targeted at you from that person that really didn't send it, and now you've got a malware in there. But now you've got to go back and think behind what the attacker's aim was. Was it just to hack the machine? What can he gain from it? That machine may contain some information, a little bit of information. The goal is to get far deeper and greater into the organization to get to the key ingredients in it. Whether it's cardholder information, whether it's the patents that they hold. So it's all about time. How much time can you be on the network? Have the malware be put in there, do social engineering to find a way to get it on the network. And once on the network, whether it's crafted malware to a specific person or whether you brought it in through a USB key that had an auto launch that launched it from within the secretary's machine, it's all about collecting information and doing reconnaissance. And once you've collected that reconnaissance, you get deeper and deeper into the network. So if you get access to, for example, on one machine, and that has access to Active Directory, and eventually you can work your way up to Active Directory, which then has access to other segments and networks, you begin to get penetration. And once you've got penetration, eventually you'll get to the sensitive parts of the information within the corporation. So then how then do you block it? So again, if you look at next generation firewalls, what is it that they're trying to solve? They're beginning to solve this particular problem. And it's a breed of products that are coming out right now that specifically targeted malware that's targeting with a 0-day signature, which means that that malware, taking something which is robust, morphing it, and crafting it for that organization, will then now be sent to you. There will not be a signature in any of the honeypot sites, so none of your IPS IDS systems will trigger. And you will not know that it's malware because there's no signature. So what then do you do? You need to be able to sandbox that. So if you've got an executable and you say, hey, is that executable something that's signed properly? Well, if it's signed, it's probably an update. But if it's not signed, then you can look up your IPS IDS table sets and signatures against it. And if you don't have a signature set for it, you sandbox it. There are many technologies out there in the industry. You can either have an appliance in your network so that the data doesn't leave. So especially if you have what I talked about, creating segmentation within your network, within applications, within the different subnets, you can have that all localized to an appliance. Or if it's coming from the internet, you can say if it comes from the internet, it's public information, maybe you can send it to the cloud for analysis. And you can scale that way. So that's an example where you can sandbox. Sandbox technology is not something new. It's been around for 20 years, but it's beginning to be more widely adopted in the next generation firewall space. So once you have the sandbox technology, then you can begin to do interesting things. You can start saying, what types of information do I want to sandbox, run, and figure out? What kinds of information would be considered pertinent and be considered malware, as an example? So if you've got an executable, or maybe a PDF with active controls in it, or maybe an Android APK file, and you upload it and you trigger it, and you find that it begins to call home to command control centers, begins to change registry keys, begins to infuse itself into a running process, and immediately tries to delete itself. That's a telltale sign of modern malware. So you can automatically, hopefully you have the technologies, if you pick the right products, be able to then say, here's clearly something that is considered malware. Let's go ahead and write a signature set for it and push it out to isolate that particular malware. So that's the first step. But once you start beginning to do that, you begin to have intelligence, because if enough of these samples come, you can begin to see a trend of how malware works.
And to add to that, I think part of what we're seeing that's effective in the industry and helping George Mason protect himself against the stuff the University of Maryland is seeing and the community at large and the global network is the ability to share this and have that cloud service. So if you have an automated system that's sandboxing these unknown file types that are coming into the network that have no signature, and we're able to detonate those in a sandbox or a VM, and we can identify it as being malware, and then write a signature for it, share that signature with the good people, the good guys, right? This is one way to try to combat what's the active malware, the progression of malware. So just to add to.
So maybe I'll add a little twist to this now. We've talked about two different common technologies implemented in a network, a firewall and an IPS IDS. Let's throw a twist, URL filtering. It's a common topic used in corporations, not as much in universities of freedom of speech. But when you think of URL filtering, who can give me some ideas as to what conjures up in your mind? What is it you're trying to control? What is it you're trying to protect? Porn, yeah, that's usually what you want to stop. HR has a concern about it, and they don't want peers being able to oversee your shoulders. Yeah, good one. Anything else? Financial accounts. So you're thinking more data leakage, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. So from a URL filtering perspective, what are you looking for? Specific categories of locations that you're connecting to? Because data leakage I think of as what are types of attachments associated with it. But when I think of URL, I'm thinking of sites, websites. Okay, money trend, interesting, yes.
You can also go against known malware sites with this list on there.
Now that gets interesting. So this is where I wanted the conversation to go. You mentioned malware sites. So when people think about URL filtering, there's a traditional bucket people tend to fall into and saying, I want to have corporate compliance. And in this respect, they think of, like you mentioned, porn site restrictions, maybe access to business sites, etc. But as part of this, you can create categories, whether it's a custom category or a predefined category to botnet sites, malware sites, and this then becomes part of threat protection. So again, now there's a third element to the whole putting together this entire package of threat protection. So once you've got this, this is still at the initial stages of trying to protect your network. And I talked about the initial threat as well as looking at zero-day threats attacking at you. But let's think forward. How do malware writers try to write the code so that they can get back out to command control centers? There has to be an Achilles heel in a lot of this, in how malware works, because they need to get back. Can anyone guess what is the common thing that they use to be able to phone home? They can't hard code an IP address because that could change. They could move servers around, they could go from one country to another. What then do they use? Anyone want to venture a guess? Who said that? Right.
What did he say?
DNS. So you use DNS with domains. So a malware writer might conceivably have part of its code, have maybe thousands, if not tens of thousands of domain names, already pre-listed. And what it will do then is do rogue DNS lookups. The malware writers will pick one or two, register, deregister, keep moving on so that it's not easy to track where they are. And as the machines move, use different domains, different IP addresses. So it's a good neat trick, right? With DNS, you can go ahead and register a domain, and all of the malware that's out there will phone home to the right servers. Well, that's the Achilles heel. So now you can start planning and deploying so-called firewalls that are aware of these. What do I mean by aware of this? They look for DNS queries that are to domains that are not registered. Well, who else would do that except malware? So you can do a couple of interesting things with it. Well, at the initial onset, you can say, let's go ahead and black hole this, prevent malware from phoning home so there's no data leakage. Well, that's easy enough, right? You can go ahead and create maybe a loopback address, tell that a firewall.
Hi, point for clarification. Are you talking about the fire, when you're talking about looking for domains that are not registered? Are you talking about your system looking for something that's calling out of your system to a domain that's not registered, to look for a domain that's not registered?
Right, so if a malware payload has been launched and installed on your PC, so now it's on your PC, you're unaware, you're using your computer, it's collecting information, and it wants to send that information home. So how then does it do it? It will do a DNS query. If it doesn't work, it'll just keep doing DNS queries from one domain to another until one of the DNS domains that it's looking for has been registered. It knows the IP address, sends a quick reply off. So one way to protect yourself against that would be having a smart enough next generation firewall that will then say, okay, if I see my clients making DNS queries to domains that are not registered, why don't I just point it to my loopback address and drop the packet? Now I've protected you. That's an interesting technology. Now you've taken that next step, which is stopping malware from being able to get out. You haven't cleaned it, but you've prevented it from going out. But you could go one step further and say, if I'm going to block it, why not log it? Well, if I'm logging it, now you have reports that you can generate and say, here are my infected machines in my network that are making this rogue DNS domain name calls. I can go in and, clean up that machine or re-image it. Yes?
I'm just curious, I mean, I don't know how many people type in URLs, but sometimes that's what you're forced to do, and sometimes you misspell something, sometimes you mistype. You're gonna then be hitting, a domain name that doesn't exist, and is this thing gonna do this? All of a sudden, guards are gonna come to my PC and arrest me because I did this, or I can't do my job?
So that's interesting. So let's think through for a moment, right? So let's say you typed in a URL to go to a known site, and you mistyped it. It happens to be people love mistyped cells because porn sites tend to really take advantage of it. But hopefully you have URL categorizations that say that these are the categories I allow, these are the categories I protect you from going out to, and you'll be blocked, and you'll get a nice warning page that says you're blocked from going to that site. And you'll say, oh, oops, sorry. If you've really changed the URL and you go to a domain that doesn't exist, yeah, possibly what you'll see is just a block site, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything because just you'll see a few hits from the PC that from your report perspective, that PC made 2 or 3 calls. You'll know what those URLs are when you look at the report. You can see it's a typo. He meant, excuse me, he meant to go to CNN. He typed in CBN, or well, CBN is still a legit name, but but you get my drift. So you can kind of protect yourself against that and say that was a legitimate. But if all of a sudden you start seeing 10,000 DNS lookups from that PC over a course of 1 hour, that might be a hint that it's more than fast typist. It's a very fast processor doing a very fast lookup. so far interesting. I've taken you from how a malware gets fused into a network to how typical IPS systems can figure it out, to going to zero-day threats, to taking a look at DNS to try to stop those zero-day attacks. And I've even gone one step further to be able to create reports that generate which are your infected machines. But now that I've taken you this path, what do you think one could go one step further? If you really wanted to dig in and see what was on that payload, more than likely there might be a UDP packet sent out to the command control center, but you're intercepting it. What could you do you think? You could go one step further. What if the firewall were to say, instead of sending it to my loopback address and doing a TCP handshake and dropping it, what if I sent it to my internal server? It says that DNS name resolves to my DNS, to my internal server, which is where you collect the data. These rogue malware will then do a TCP handshake. Here's my payload, drop it, thank you very much. Now you've got that payload. Makes for a very nice research project, doesn't it? You can sit back and take a look at the end of the day from all of those infected machines, what are they dropping off? They may ask for a query, but more than likely they're just dropping stuff off. So you could start doing some research and seeing what kinds of information are sending. Maybe it's just metadata, maybe there's more. But it gives you a nice project internally because it's your data and it's in your network and the server is in your network. So you can start thinking the next step through if you have research and you're curious, what is it that we stopped? So you cleanse the machine, you wipe clean, you re-imaged it, but you also have a repository of what it attempted to get out into the internet. So these are some of the trends that's out there in the industry. These are some of the technologies that vendors are looking into and implementing. And when you take this path across, you begin to see that there is some vendors which is a catch-up because it's a big machine changing the methodology of how a firewall used to work, and they've deployed this over the last 20 years. So people have had firewalls and they think, okay, I've blocked everything but port 80. And they fail to understand malware has evolved, and opening up port 80 is essentially every type of traffic, every application that has come out since probably the last 15 to 20 years, ever since internet became important, whether it's Facebook, whether it's YouTube, or function controls within Facebook, whether it's chat, games, Twitter, it's all on port 80. What goes interesting even one step further is as we begin to look at trends, typically you'll find that 20% of the network traffic might be encrypted traffic. So what then do you there? What do you do there? With encrypted traffic, there are some things you can play with it. You've begun to see now in Wi-Fi, a lot of times you'll get this authorization certificate you have to sign that allows that Wi-Fi AP to decrypt, be the man in the middle, to check for malware by having a separate TCP connection. So you have one from that PC to the AP, and then from there out to the server, and then it proxies that connection. So here's another example where even if the malware writers were to encrypt the data, you could potentially break that encryption if it's standard encryption and not proprietary encryption, and be able to look at that data and see if it's something that is worthy of, from a URL perspective, as an example, are they going to right sites? But it's quite easy to see where the payload would be. For a lot of cases, it would be email attachments. So if you just take a simple category like email attachments and say, I'm only interested in decrypting email attachments, all the standard Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo Mail, and those are encrypted, and taking a look at attachments and seeing if those attachments contain malware, payloads of malware.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the concepts Hassanain has just described in terms of what we're seeing are the best ways potentially to innovate and help with this cybersecurity problem that we have, with constant malware attacks, is they all kind of correlate into one another. They're actually all related. They all feed into one another. So finding new malware, identifying it on a VM, gives you those domain names, gives you that it's querying and phoning home. You see what it's doing on the system. That feeds into our URL categories, then it allows you to create these internal routing, systems so that you're actually, collecting payloads that are attempting to leave your network. So those are some of the innovations around the network security, prevent data loss and prevent malware. We'll go ahead and turn it over to questions because
We have time for a couple of questions. I'd like to ask one first, though, please.
Okay.
It's how you and Palo Alto are working with your customers and what recent product introductions or service introductions or Palo Alto developments are you particularly excited about?
In terms of what Palo Alto Network does, all of the concepts that I touched upon are key technology differentiations that we implement as part of next generation firewall. So as a next generation firewall, these are key to trying to find and isolate malware. Key thing about malware is malware doesn't have any bounds. It could be traffic that goes from the internet into the corporation. It could go within laterally from one segment to another. But more importantly, which is interesting, is that people are no longer thinking or beginning to start thinking, what about in VM? You have hosts, ESXi hosts, and within it you may have 10, 20, 30 guests. And you begin to have within that host database servers, web servers, and when you begin to have each of them communicate within that host, you need to have a firewall inside it as well. So one of the key partnerships that Palo Alto Networks has done is that work with VM vendors to be able to have it all integrated so that when you go ahead and bring up a VM, which takes but a couple of minutes, that entire change control process of making sure it flows through a firewall is all integrated. So these are some of the key technologies that Palo Alto Networks has invested in.
Okay, thank you. Are there a couple of questions?
Anyone else wants to ask?
I have a quick question on from an architectural point of view, defense in depth. You talked about the firewall, IPS, IDS. Now we're going to more point products. We're including a lot of the same, next gen firewall and UTMs, putting everything in one device. What is your perspective from having, a layered approach of security with different multi-vendor, as well as having, having a defensive depth strategy?
So this is something that has been evolved, and if you look at analyst reports, they used to say that you need, just because of horsepower, computing power, and architectural design, it's always good to have best of practices devices. And that's why you had layered products. You had the firewall, you had the IPS, you had the URL, sandboxing technology, all in there separately. Where this is evolving is that analysts have begun to realize you need to have a consolidation of logs. So in only to be able to identify that a particular threat came in, who was the user, what was the application, and how he exited, you have to have a unified logging mechanism. How then do you do that? All of this functionality has to be done within the box. If you want to go down that path, you need to answer the next basic question. Can you develop a product that can handle all of these processing layered approaches without compromising the speed? So if you look at traditional systems where what they call, as you would call UTM, each time you turn on a feature, you have a decrement in performance. So next generation firewalls, if you begin to look at them and understand them, you'll begin to see the ones that stand out are the ones that re-architect their platform so that they can do in a single pass one view of that packet and be able to identify all of these components without having to revisit that packet again and again and again. So therefore, when you did that single pass, you made that hit, and you've already taken the performance, and you know what the control performance is.
But certainly taking into consideration multiple vendors' signatures and continuing to have that layered approach for sensitive information. That's important.
I think maybe one more question.
I was going to ask you, when you're looking at the logs and trying to figure out, let's say, retrieve DNS denials or unsuccessful attempts, that's basically a reactive approach, and by the time you've come through and you've thrown an alert on that, you may have lost your data by then. How about if you had like an authenticating proxy that would immediately deny an unauthenticated process that may have spun off as a malware? Would that be a better approach?
Well, that's all part of the next generation. I didn't talk about some of the ways you may want to configure a typical next generation firewall, but that's all part of the process. I went back to the reason why we talked originally, what was the fundamental basis of a firewall. It was to allow an authenticated user to an authorized application on a specific LAN. That in the old days meant it was a port and it was an IP segment. Today, that traffic would be identified user specifically. So it doesn't matter whether you're coming in from an iPad connecting to an Exchange server, whether you're using your laptop or you're using your workstation. They're all different IP addresses, yet it's tied to that user. The policy follows that user. So it would be that user to that application, irrespective of the means by which you came in. And whether the IP address was divvied up by a DHCP server out of an SSL VPN that you connected in from.
But that first thread that comes through is going to go through to the end user. The idea is, though, with the sandbox or cloud service, we're able to identify it, know what exactly happened to on their system, report to the system admin, so they can go remediate, and then, then a signature is produced and then shared.
Yeah,